All right. Hey, everyone.
Hello, hello, hello.
Well, it's good to be with everyone live and in person at this Inform event at the Commonwealth Club. My name is Tony Xu. I'm the co-founder and CEO of DoorDash. And I'm actually really excited to be putting Guy in an interviewee seat, for once, as we discuss his awesome book, How I Built This, covering the many lessons that he's learned and stories that he's, shared about hundreds of entrepreneurs who've done amazing things in this world. And, I couldn't be more thrilled. As the speakers were saying earlier, please, this is going to be an interactive event. So as you're thinking about questions for Guy, prepare them. There are some note cards for you as you're thinking about those topics throughout the night. And then for those watching this online, please also use the text chat feature in YouTube. We will make sure and do our best to prescribe those questions and also ask them towards the end as well. Well, with that, maybe we should just kick it off. Guy, you've done a lot of different things in your career, and I actually thought, for the benefit of those online and those here in the room, maybe we start talking about you. I know you're so used to covering other people, but why entrepreneurship? Why, tell the stories of these founders and entrepreneurs?
I was just thinking as you were introducing me that of course, we've seen each other since our interview on the show. I think it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I can't remember when you were on. Just about a mile from here, where we did the interview face to face, and we sat in a very small room for 3.5 hours, which is something that a lot of people don't know. Which is my interviews are very long, 3.5, 4 hours, and we edit them down. But thank you. So thank you for turning the tables. Why entrepreneurs? It's interesting. I did not ever want to be an entrepreneur. My dad and mom were. They came to the United States in 1970 and had their children here, and they had a small business. My dad had a jewelry shop his entire career. He was an engineer for some time, and then in his early 40s, he decided to start his own business. It was a big risk, right? It was a huge leap to leave his career as an engineer, working in the aerospace industry in Southern California, to start a jewelry store. But he did with my mom, and they really grinded. It was a lot of work. I remember when I was a kid in West Covina, watching them go through these, these dot matrix printouts of leads, cold calling people about their jewelry. They sold pearls, and eventually got a little store in downtown LA. In an office building, and that was how they sustained a family of 4 children and built a career. They were never, my dad's business was never huge, but he had 5 or 6 employees at a certain time, and it was what he did, but it was stressful. I remember there were years when the economy wasn't great and people weren't buying pearls, and my dad is now 80, and he was, I didn't know this at the time, but I only discovered later, was just incredibly well respected in the industry. To this day, people who still work in it know my dad and just talk about him as such an honest broker and a good person and a mentor, and things I didn't know as a kid. What I saw was the struggle and the worry and the anxiety of starting a business. And I think I grew up at a time, I grew up in the 80s and early 90s, when I think a lot of kids were pushed to go into law or medicine or sort of stable careers. Think even in a sense maybe you were too a little bit because of your parents, their immigrant story. And my parents wanted a stable, secure life for their children, and so that's what I thought I would do, maybe go into law or a career that where I'd get a job, and that was really what I did. I went into journalism and pursued this. I had this incredibly fortunate career, because early in my career, I was given opportunities to report from overseas. I joined National Public Radio when I was 22, and at 25, I became the Berlin bureau chief. So I had this like very fortunate, lucky break at an early age in my life, where I spent 7 years overseas covering Eastern Europe and then eventually the Iraq War and Afghanistan. And so I had this really rich series of experiences that I wanted to do, that I wanted to pursue. But over time, I really began to think about the stories we were telling as reporters. And one of the things that I realized was that I went into the profession to, I think I went into the profession of journalism to, and I think a lot of reporters and journalists do this, because I thought it was a bridge. It was a way to explain how people live to other people. So I ended up covering a lot of conflicts: Pakistan, India, in Kashmir, Sunni Shia in Iraq, the warring factions of Afghanistan. I covered Israel, Palestine. And in my mind, I thought, if only I could explain how this group of people lives and then explain how this group of people lives, then these groups will understand each other. And actually, I could make some kind of abstract contribution to bettering the world. What I think over time, what I realized was that wasn't the impact I felt that I was having. And so about 12 years ago, I left the world of news. About 13 years ago, I left the world of news, and then eventually left NPR entirely, and decided to embark on my own kind of midlife crisis, like my dad had, and started my own businesses, production companies. And what I realized, and this really happened by chance. I basically became burned out. I went from NPR to CNN, and I failed miserably at CNN. I was a terrible television reporter. I was not made for television. And in my early 30s, I had been overseas for many, many years and really worked hard chasing something that I wasn't sure what it was that I was chasing. Recognition or achievement. I don't know what it was. But in my early 30s, I had an opportunity to take a year out and do a fellowship, a journalism fellowship. It was the same year my first son was born. And I took a class that year at Harvard Business School. I'd never taken a business school class in my life. I didn't know anything about business. I was a journalist. I knew how to land in Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey or in Kabul and find a translator quickly and get a hotel and get money and start reporting. I could be on the air that night. So from that perspective, I was resourceful, but I didn't know how to start a business. I didn't know anything about business. I took a class at Harvard Business School, and I was stunned that in that class, the way they teach business school was through the case study method. I knew nothing about it. Okay, this is in like 2008. And I thought to myself, so these people are paying $120,000 a year to hear stories, right? I thought to myself, this is kind of nuts, because this is what I do for a living. And it planted a seed in my mind, which is, could I do a version of that? Could I tell these stories in an even richer way, in a deeper way, and make it free, make it accessible to everybody? Could I? And the reason why those stories just spoke to me was because it just never occurred to me until I took that class that business stories are like heroes' journeys. They have you can find all those moments on the hero's journey arc, the Joseph Campbell arc, in a business story. There's a hero. Hero has a crazy idea. Everybody tells hero, your idea is crazy. Hero must leave the village to pursue the idea. Hero finds a mentor. Mentor dies. Hero ends up battling a dragon, venture capitalist, whatever they are. Right? And eventually, over time, the hero overcomes all of these challenges and triumphs. It's Star Wars, it's Harry Potter, it's Odysseus, it's Noah. And I started to see elements of that in business stories. It has all of the drama of the human experience. The lying on the bathroom floor, crying in the fetal position, the incredible triumphs and joys. I mean, you've been through it yourself, went through it during the pandemic. It comes and goes. I mean, and so in those stories, I realized that, in those examples of founders, I realized that you can tell incredible narrative, cinematic visual narrative, and you can actually help people understand how they might do something like that themselves. So that's how it began.
I love it. Democratizing HBS is what I wrote down as
exactly. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, you know, the way that I read the book, it was that it was broken into kind of three sections, right? On trying to uncover all facets of founding a business and discussing the hero's journey. The first section is getting the call to actually, you know, make the idea a thing. And you know, I'm kind of curious, what have you learned about, you know, new ideas or how people discover their ideas? I mean, you've covered hundreds of stories. I'm sure you've spoken to thousands of people. Obviously, you have your dad as well as your own journey. What have you learned about how to source these ideas, the opening?
You know, it's obviously the journey is different for every single entrepreneur, but the main similarity is a person identifies a problem that they think they can solve. And it's something that is not just a problem that they have, but a problem that they believe lots of other people do. So, for example, you're a student. Lots of students want an In-N-Out burger. You know that you can actually drive to In-N-Out Burger and deliver the burgers to them. And maybe you can create an app, and maybe they'll use that app to, and then In-N-Out will find out and tell you to stop doing it. That's your story, by the way. That's how you began, right? And so it's you see that there's a problem and that there's a need to solve that problem, and it could be anything from, you know, Lisa Price of Carol's Daughter, who didn't feel like there were moisturizers and lotions for Black women that spoke to her and that filled a need that she had, and that she knew that there were lots of women like her that she knew in Brooklyn who might have the same problem and the same you know, frustrations. It's virtually every founder that I've interviewed. It's Howard Schultz who didn't believe that you could get outstanding coffee like the kind of coffee he had in Milan in the United States, easily accessible, that was available everywhere, outstanding coffee. And so you identify a problem and you figure out how to execute it better than anybody else. And that's the basic beginnings of any business. That's on how I built this.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, you know, the ideas you mentioned, whether it's, you know, the idea for delivering lunch and dinner, or starting a new type of coffee shop, or building new lotions. I mean, these don't sound like original ideas.
No.
And
right.
I mean, I guess, you know, especially for folks thinking about starting a business, I mean, what can you tell us about what you've learned in speaking with hundreds of people? You know, what is the bar for the goodness of this idea? Does it really have to be that original, or what have you learned about that?
I've been thinking about this so much lately because, you know, when you have a business idea, not just a business idea, but a product idea, or say you work in a company and you have an idea for doing things in a different way. And I'm sure all of you have experienced a version of this, which is you tell somebody or a group of people about your idea, your business, your product, or your innovative, you know, workplace change. And inevitably somebody will say to you, well, how is that different from what we're doing? Or how is that different from what's out there? Or how is that new, right? And that's a very natural question to ask, because we humans, we think that for something to have value, it should be new or different. And that actually to have appeal, it should be new or different. But in actual fact, very few things are new or different, right? I mean, if you think about things that are really new or different, like, I don't know, Google Glass or Quibi or blue ketchup from Heinz, they all fail, okay? Now, it's not to say they're bad ideas. It's just that a really, really new original idea doesn't always actually find an audience. Many of the most celebrated companies in the world, Google and Facebook, for example, were founded, I mean, the technology existed. What they did was they executed better. And the reason why this is a top of mind is because if I look at, out of the almost 550 interviews we've had on How I Built This, probably 90% of those companies did not create something entirely new, which I think is very hard to do, right? Virtually all of them improved on an existing technology, executed better. And one of my favorite examples of this is a chicken restaurant called Raising Cane's. Okay, Raising Cane's, I don't think they have, I think the closest one's in like Stockton or Sacramento. It's a restaurant, a fast food restaurant that is the second most profitable fast food restaurant in terms of sales per unit. Number one is Chick-fil-A, chicken restaurant. Number two is Raising Cane's. In-N-Out Burger is like number 4, okay? This is not total revenue because McDonald's is obviously number one, but if you just account for how many restaurants they have and how much revenue each restaurant does, Raising Cane's number 2. It started in 1996 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This is a restaurant started by a guy named Todd Graves who literally went to an Alaskan salmon fishing boat for a summer and an oil refinery in LA in the spring before that to basically get as much money as he could to qualify for an SBA loan in order to start his first restaurant in Baton Rouge. He made $50,000 in a 7-month period in the world's most dangerous jobs, and he took that money and he founded a chicken finger restaurant in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, this is 1996. His menu is chicken fingers, Texas toast, coleslaw, crinkle cut fries. That's it. That's the whole menu, okay? Now, in 1996, people are saying to him, "You're nuts. You're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You got to have a Cajun-flavored chicken finger." No. You got to sell salads. It's healthy. Listen, if people want salads, they can go to another restaurant. I do chicken fingers, Texas toast, coleslaw, and crinkle cut fries. And the thing is that if you walk into a restaurant with those 4 things in the menu, basically what they're saying to you is, "Hey, guy, we make this better than anybody else on planet Earth because that's all we sell. You can't lean on the Frosties or the burgers or the tacos or anything else. Like, if we fail in these 4 things, our restaurant collapses." And so he didn't invent chicken fingers.
Yeah.
Chick-fil-A was out there. He just came up with a concept and executed so well. Today, the menu hasn't changed. They have 600 restaurants, and it's an incredible story. And it's those kinds of stories that I think really tell you so much about how businesses actually operate.
Yeah. Well, why do you think they execute so much better? I mean, to your point, I mean, there's nothing special about a chicken finger or original, but somehow, number 2 sales per unit profitability. I mean, that's incredible.
I mean, it's something, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago or months ago when we saw each other last about Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A, obviously, people have different opinions about Chick-fil-A because, but think about Chick-fil-A. I mean, it is a company that is open 6 days a week. They are closed on Sunday, and it is the most profitable fast food chain in the United States. Okay, they're closed 1 day of the week. So every other chain has the advantage of 7 days, and they're open 6 days. Plus, I think they have some of the highest employee retention rates in the country. They have a very clear way for employees to rise up the ranks. Same with In-N-Out Burger. So if you want to be a manager or you want to work in corporate and you apply and day one you say, "Hey, I really want to work in management one day," they'll put you on a path to do that. And Raising Cane's, some of these companies that are successful, they do that. You know this. They focus on their people, and now it's very fashionable to say, "Okay, my employees are number 1, my customers are 2, my investors are 3. It used to be, right, investors 1 and customers 2. But now it's becoming normal, and as it should have been all along, for companies to put their employees at the top. I think the companies that execute well have been doing it longer. They've understood that longer. And I've seen that across the board. I've seen that across the board in companies that, especially consumer-facing products and brands, that continue to grow.
One of the things that you talk about in your book is this, concept between what's dangerous versus what's scary. And I heard it a little bit in your own career, in which it sounds like, minus the burnout part, maybe you could have had future careers as a journalist and as a reporter.
Yep.
Yet you chose to take that midlife crisis and do something about it. Your father did something similar. Obviously, hundreds of people that you've spoken to have done that in your book. Can you maybe tell more, especially for those in the audience considering starting a company? Maybe they have the idea to do something better than what was previously existed. How do you choose what's dangerous versus what's scary for your career?
Yeah, and this is a concept that I borrowed from Jim Koch, who's the founder of Boston Beer Company. And that's where I first heard of the concept when he came to do an interview with me 5 years ago. And I should preface it by saying, starting a business isn't, to me, the apex of a fulfilling career. You can actually be transformational within a company, right? You can actually do. I mean, Johnny Ive worked at Apple. There are people who have transformed companies within those companies and have been internal entrepreneurs. You probably have them at DoorDash. I think this concept of dangerous versus scary has been really helpful for me as a framework, right? Because there are lots of things that we do that are really scary. Getting up on stage in front of people is scary. I've been doing it for 12 years and I still get nervous every time. I just did a live show in Chicago I do a children's podcast called Wow in the World, and I'm a character. I play a character. I'm on stage. I sing. I dance. I know, it's weird. You can't imagine, right? And we're in front of 5,000 people at the Chicago Theater, and my heart is pounding even to this day, and I've been doing this for a long time. So we do things that are scary. But scary is okay. Scary is important. It's the things that are dangerous that are different. And so the story comes from Jim Cook, which is he had a really, really great career at Boston Consulting Group. He had family, he had 2 kids, and he was married, and he was on track to become partner, but he just didn't feel fulfilled. He just didn't feel it. And and not everyone goes through this, but there are some people who are very successful, lawyers or in finance, and there's a point where they just feel like, I've got to do something on my own. But you get trapped by the golden handcuffs, right? Because it's stable and you're in the career, and it's the responsible thing to do is just keep doing it. But he thought about his life, and he thought, if I don't try this, if I don't try to create my own business, and he really wanted to make beer, by the way, okay? This is in the early 80s when American beer was a joke. I mean, American beer was, there's a famous Monty Python sketch, you might remember, where they're talking about piss, beer, and urine, right? So the idea that you could create an American beer that was not only great, but that would be celebrated around the world, and that would kickstart a craft beer revolution in the United States. Nobody thought that in 1984, but Jim Cook really wanted to do this. And so he left his job at Boston Consulting Group because he thought to himself, if I don't do this, it's dangerous. Because if I stay here and I wake up and I'm 70 years old and I didn't do it, I'm going to regret not having done it. Now, I don't want to regret. I don't want to have regret. That's dangerous. Is it scary to take the leap and to try this? It is. He also knew, and this is something that's really important, and I think you can speak to this too, Tony. He also knew that there was a fallback. Doing something risky doesn't mean you jump out of an airplane without a parachute. And actually, I think here in the Bay Area, there's been this myth perpetuated. I don't necessarily think intentionally. I think it's been mythologized in the media and of these brash entrepreneurs, and we can see these Apple TV shows now and about what happened. But these brash entrepreneurs who jump out of the airplane without a parachute and they just go for it, and they're risk takers. And the reality is, at least in the more than 500 interviews I've done, there are, I can count on one hand entrepreneurs who fit that bill. Mark Cuban is one of them. He's like, go for it. It's, I'm going to just take this risk, and if I crash and burn and lose everything, well, I do. But most of them don't do that. Most of them mitigate their risks. Jim Cook, for example, he didn't leave Boston Consulting Group one day. He spent 9 months researching the beer industry in the U.S., trying to find bottlers, trying to craft a recipe that he made in his own kitchen, okay, to come up with a really good beer. He talked to friends, many of whom told him he was crazy, but he really looked at he did really careful market research to determine whether he could actually do this. And when he left Boston Consulting Group, he also knew that if this venture totally failed, he could probably find work as a consultant again. And that's the important thing, which is that great entrepreneurs are also, they're risk takers. It's a big risk to do that, but they mitigate those risks.
One of the things as, these ideas become projects and the projects actually get incorporated and kind of turn into companies is, you actually have to build a business, right? And this is kind of like the second part of, your book as you kind of start, you've made the call now as the entrepreneur to actually go and do this.
Yeah.
And now you got to turn it into a business. And actually, this question's from the audience, which is, you talk about having a plan to actually turn the idea into something profitable. Can you maybe say more about what some of the best entrepreneurs have done during this kind of middle phase to actually turn the idea into something concrete and turn it from a project into a business?
It's interesting because I think that we have an instinct, especially when we're building. And you probably went through versions of this, and I've been through versions of this with the shows I've created and with the businesses that I've started, which is the instinct is to focus on what we're not doing right, thinking that that is actually going to help us improve. And so we often become very self-critical of our processes. We often look at other competitors and we try to figure out how to differentiate what we're doing in the marketplace. And I think that successful companies, whether they do this intentionally or not, are able to kind of avoid that, certainly in the early stages, and really focus on trying things out and taking good risks, right? I mean, and really kind of pursuing something, even if it doesn't seem like it's working right away. And of course, at a certain point, knowing when to make a pivot. I mean, DoorDash did not take off right away. DoorDash was not immediately successful. It took a lot of time before it started to get adopted. And it was really adopted here in the Bay Area at the beginning and tech areas, but it wasn't a mainstream product for a long time. And there were plenty of people who could have said, I don't know if this is going to go anywhere. And there may have been people who did say that. Or plenty, right?
Yeah.
Or people who said, the big guys are just going to swallow you up.
Right.
Now you're the big guy. But I think that's the key. It's like having the sort of the stamina and the ability to push forward even when there are doubters, but also to have a clear the sort of the clear-headedness to understand when it's time to change course. We just did an episode on Discord, on Jason Citron Discord, who started the business here. He moved to Berkeley. It's a great, amazing story of how he built this company. And his goal was to build a video game company. He loves video games.
Yep.
He's a gamer. He wanted to make lots of massive multiplayer online games. And that really was the plan. But Discord really was the thing that took off. And it was the thing that people wanted. And so that was where they focused their energy on. I mean, even his first business, which was he created a game, an app.
Yeah.
What really worked, and that didn't work, but what really worked was when he built a social network platform that enabled people to communicate playing these games. And so that's where they ended up focusing their attention on. So part of it is pushing forward, but part of it's also recognizing when it's time to try something different. It's hard to know, but it's one of those kind of, it's one of those approaches that I think just that almost kind of reveals itself to you when the time is right.
And what have you learned in speaking with, these founders and entrepreneurs in some of these crucible moments, right, where catastrophe certainly is looming right, in front of your eyes? Sometimes maybe you got to make the pivot. The other story that comes to mind that I know you tell in listening to your interviews is Slack. Slack also wanting to build a game, actually.
Yep.
And very similarly, like Discord finds out that this messaging platform underneath is actually the thing that people want versus the game itself. I guess, what do the founders do, or what have you found inspiration in maybe studying when they meet those crucible moments, which inevitably hit everyone?
Yeah.
What is your advice maybe to folks in the audience that may be going through that now?
Yeah, I mean, invariably, and How I Built This is not a show about success. I know, of course, it's like a romantic comedy. You always know that at the end, they're either going to fall in love or they're not going to fall in love, but they're friends. And my favorite romantic comedy is Mrs. Doubtfire that takes place here in San Francisco because it's a great ending, but they don't get back together. Sorry if I ruined it for you. Sorry. It's a great, but you know the basic arc of a rom-com. And so sometimes people will say, oh, why don't you focus on companies that failed miserably on how I built this? And what I say is, because that's not what the show is. There are great shows that do that. But what we're doing is we're not focusing on the success or the money or the wealth. We're focusing on those crucible moments and the crises, because I want people to understand that building a successful business, any business, is really, really hard. It's really hard. And I think a lot of us, we fetishize founders and we say, look at these heroes. We talk about Elon Musk or Sergey and Larry or Tony. And I don't want people to think of founders as superheroes. I want them to think of people who are like us, and that we can actually do a version of that if we think about it in the right way. One of the most important things that I look for when I look to interview a founder is failure, is our setbacks, because that is what we can learn from. That's where we learn the most. We learn from people's failures, not from their successes. Having somebody come on and say, and then we did this, and then we knocked it out of the park there, and then we were done. It's not an interesting story. It's not useful for us. We need to hear from founders about the moments when they were on the bathroom floor crying and how they overcame it. And we had an episode a couple months ago. I interviewed John Hendricks, who's the founder of Discovery, the Discovery Network, and it is an unbelievable story. I mean, this guy was he in the 80s when cable was just starting. He had no experience, he had no connections. He was never done television in his life, but he really was obsessed with documentaries, and he wanted to create a cable channel that would just air documentaries. And the first few years, it was just, they were basically buying up old BBC documentaries and licensing them. It was before people really licensed media. So the BBC was like, sure, extra cash. And they would license it to him for peanuts. But the satellite transmission fees were so high. I mean, they were paying like $400,000 a week to reach, 10,000 homes in America. And that company, like 3 years in, was 4 days away from bankruptcy, and they got they signed a term sheet with a backer who then withdrew the term sheet a day before, and so they actually were insolvent. And he was walking to the office to basically tell everybody that they were shut down. Yeah. And in like the 11th hour, 59th minute, was basically saved by this guy, John Malone, who is a massive media entrepreneur, founder of Liberty Media. Now, obviously very much involved in Discovery and Warner. And he believed in what they were doing. He loved the documentaries, and he had seen them. He was one of those 10,000 homes, and in the last moment, he saved it. But even at that moment, John Hendricks was feeling despair, but he still believed that this thing could work. He believed in his heart that Americans wanted high quality television. And in the end, he managed to succeed. Now, I don't, it's interesting to hear what he thinks about Discovery today, because he has a very different opinion about the channel today than the one that he built. But he did do it, and he did withstand, and that was just one of the more dramatic moments, but withstand many, many moments of people saying no, people turning him down, and failing.
Yeah. Would you say that is I guess, if there is a singular trait that unites entrepreneurs, and, because all their stories are different, all the pivots are different, all the specific business tactics are a bit different.
Yeah.
But the one thing that seems to be true, whether it's at the beginning, the middle, even in the later stages of a company, is they have to overcome rejection.
Yes, 100%. And that is, as you say, every story is different. Your story is different from Topo Awotana's story, who founded Calendly, is different from Stuart Butterfield's story, is different from Sarah Blakely's story of Spanx, or, Shanlin Ma, who founded Zola, who's our latest episode, one of the biggest wedding planning sites in the United States. Every story is different. What is similar is that every person who comes up with an idea, and I'm not talking just about founders, I'm talking about people who come up with new products or, take a risk and introduce a new way of working within a company. You will inevitably hear no or some resistance, or somebody will say, if it's such a great idea, why hasn't it been done before? If it's so good, why isn't it out there? If this delivery service you were coming up with, why haven't other people done it? And that's a natural question to ask. The thing is that there are many people who become discouraged at that point and don't pursue it. And the people who do pursue it are the ones who end up being on the show. It's not that they're smarter. It's not that they're better educated. It's that they somehow have figured out how to withstand the rejection and the no's. It doesn't mean it's fun or pain-free, but they just march forward. Now, some of them have a natural ability to do it. If you meet Mark Cuban, that guy can hear no a million times, and he has a smile on his face, and he's still in a great mood, and he's gonna go work at the bar at night and get tips, and then go out the next day and try and do it all over again. Because that's how he started. He started by installing like Lotus on computers for people, and ended up selling his business, and he made $2 million, and he was 30. And then he started the next business, which became Broadcast.com, that he sold to Yahoo, right? But sometimes people who are not naturally inclined to absorb rejection, they figure out how to deal with it by exposing themselves to rejection. It's like a version of exposure therapy, right? It's like CBT, cognitive behavioral treatment, which is you do a job that requires you to experience rejection. So a good example is Topa Watana of Calendly. He was a student at the University of Georgia, and in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and he was a child of immigrants. He actually was born in Nigeria, came to the U.S. at 15, went to the University of Georgia, and he needed to pay for college. He had no money, and he needed spending money. And he got a job as a sales rep for ADT alarm systems. Now imagine going door to door in Athens, Georgia, every day trying to sell ADT. Okay, 90% of those people are just like not even opening the door. And I asked him, I said, how did you deal with that? How did you deal with so many people not even opening the door for you or slamming the door in your face or saying not interested? And he said, because what I realized was that there was a hit rate. Eventually, I would get a yes, and when I did, I made $500 in commission, and that was such an insane amount of money that I didn't care if I got 99 no's, because all I cared about was that one yes. But that really steeled him to create a business 12 years later after he went through several different attempts to start businesses. He had a barbecue business, and he tried to import big green eggs. None of it worked, but Calendly did work, and it took a long time for people to take it seriously. He could not get a single person to invest in the business, which is in part why he owns like 75% of the company to this day. But he was able to persevere because he had that rejection exposure early in his life, and I think it's really important. It's why a lot of younger people who are interested in business, I'll say, how should I get started? And I say, go into sales. Go into sales. Learn how to hear no. Learn how to hear from people who say, I'm not interested, because that actually can turn you into somebody who can deal with it when it really matters, when you're going to investors trying to raise money.
Yeah, DoorDash heard at least 100 no's over the course of our journey, so I definitely get it. As companies start morphing maybe into more successful businesses, you kind of titled this last section of the book, The Destination, as they maybe become more recognized as brands. What are maybe the one or two things that you feel like these businesses make these businesses endure? They actually have survived somehow magically, and they become more recognized. But it's also so hard in business to kind of be able to have this long duration. Some of the brands that you listed have been around for decades, but some have kind of come and gone. And what have you learned about those that endure?
Yeah, I mean, we did WeWork on How I Built This. I did Miguel McKelvey, the co-founder of WeWork, who's and actually he's coming back on the show in a couple of weeks. You'll hear him on How I Built This Lab. Which is a second version of, we're not doing 2 episodes a week of How I Built This. and we're bringing on former founders that have been on the show and bringing them back for updates. So I'll hit you up at some point to hear what's going on. Mark Cuban has come back. You know, it's true. I mean, we've even had, WeWork. I think WeWork's the only example of a company that's not really, it's still around, but of course, in a very diminished state. The question is, I think many founders want to build a 100-year brand, right? Like you look at DoorDash and you want to have a 100-year brand. Right. Like people look at GE or Ford or Coca-Cola, these legacy companies, and they want to understand why do they exist? Why do we still buy their products? Why do we Arm & Hammer? These products that people were using in the 20s, I mean, we're still Procter & Gamble, founded during the Civil War. I mean, incredible story. But then there are other companies, Sears and Mervyn's and, I grew up in LA with Bullock's and, I mean, all of these department stores that don't exist anymore. Why? What's the story? And there are a variety of reasons, right? I mean, much of it comes down to management and decisions that were made, but some of it comes down to, I think, the connection that people have with the product and how to maintain that connection. I know I go back to food a lot, but how is it that a brand like In-N-Out Burger, which has been around since before McDonald's, how is it that it doesn't matter what time you're at an In-N-Out, there's always a line? How is that possible? They have 3 things in the menu: hamburger, cheeseburger, double. How is that possible? There's a connection that brand has developed with its customers, whether consciously or unconsciously, but they have a deep connection with their consumers. And I think that is, it's almost like a holy grail. I don't know the answer. If I did, I think I would be a multi-billionaire because I could go around and tell people how to do it. But I think that is the essential factor. It's that connection. It's this almost intangible thing about the product or service that you feel you need and you want to continue to be a part of.
Yeah. One of the things that you kind of write in this section of the book is just the importance of actually 2 things that I don't know get talked about that much, certainly not necessarily always in business school case studies, around culture and kindness. And I'm curious why those topics, like why do you cover those in this section of the book, especially when again, like a lot of this is about the hero's journey, and sometimes I don't know if culture and kindness kind of show up as the top, book ends of the hero's journey.
Yeah, and if I were to sort of like critique myself, I think that you could, and there's a lot of holes you can poke in my book or my show, and they're all fair. I think that this is, I mean, there are plenty of companies out there and founders out there, very successful founders, who I think you'd be hard pressed to say they're kind, right? I think we can imagine some of them in our minds, some incredibly successful founders of companies. But I do think that, in general, on balance, successful companies are kind companies. That kindness is sort of integrated into the culture from day one, and that it is an article of faith and part of that contract that you have, between and among the people who work with you. It's about respect. It's about listening to people. It's about elevating people. It's about your people. It's about the people who make what you do and who believe in the mission and who are part of growing it. I think that, again, there are all kinds of examples where, depending on how you look at it, you could say, well, I don't know if it's always if it's always kind or if it's always exactly what that word means. But I think of a company like Starbucks is a tricky example because there are plenty of employees who had different views on this, especially around unionization efforts. But I think it's really hard to look at somebody like Howard Schultz, who I've met a few times, and not say he's kind. He is a very kind person and leader, and when a leader behaves that way and exudes that kind of spirit, it does have a huge effect and impact on the corporate culture. It is important, and not just from not just morally, but it's also good business. It's actually good business. People want to work for kind companies.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Well, we got about 20 minutes left. I thought we'd conclude with some audience questions, as well as at the very end, I'll make sure we'll turn it right back to where we started, which is a few more questions about you. Actually, one of the questions that came up from the audience, and please, as you have them, whether you're online, please text chat. If you're here in the room, please fill out the note cards nearby. It was actually about the beginning of the journey in founding a business. And this guest really wants to know about co-founders and co-founder relationships. I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, and I find it interesting to figure out what makes a co-founder relationship work and what makes them fall apart. I love the co-founders who go to couples therapy, for example.
Yeah.
What are your observations about co-founder partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, and I think I'd love to hear your take on this too, because you have a perspective too, Tony. Look, there are a couple of very simple principles, right? It's that you have strengths and you find somebody who also has strengths that are not necessarily your strengths. And that's sort of the traditional co-founder partnership. The reality is, and what I've seen in so many of the interviews I've done, is a lot of it's just luck, because you might meet somebody who you really think is awesome, and you start a business together, and then it starts to fall apart after about a year. And that happens a lot. And then sometimes it starts to fall apart, but then you have the foresight and the wherewithal to try and work through it, which is where you go to couples therapy for co-founders. Yeah. One of my favorite stories is the story of EO Products, based here in the Bay Area, in San Rafael. Susan Griffin Black was married to her co-founder. They started the business together. They fell in love, and they built this business, and it's a really awesome company. They make beauty products and essential oils and soaps. And during the pandemic, they really pivoted into hand sanitizers and a really powerful natural products company. They own it. Well, they have 2 kids, and they also divorced. They had a divorce, and they were bickering in the office, and she talks about this on the podcast. And it was challenging, and they had to decide what they were going to do. Was one of them going to leave, or were they going to shut the company down? But they were adult enough to see that this company still had incredible potential. This is like 10, 15 years ago, when EO Products was much smaller than it is today. They divorced, and they continued out how to put the mission and the company ahead of their own egos and their own anger, frustration, or and it's hard. I mean, it's really, I don't know if I could do it, right? It's really hard. But I've seen that in several successful companies, and there are, of course, examples of companies where it does come apart.
Yeah.
And sometimes it has to come apart. Sometimes it's for the best of the company. But I'm always impressed at co-founders who can recognize the friction and can seek help, can find somebody to help them work it through, or to at least attempt to work through it. I mean, you have a co-founder, you had a co-founder, and
yeah, well, we had a team of 4, and we had a departure early on, and I think my best advice I could give on this topic is you have to work the relationships as much as you work your business. You're sprinting 24/7. Everyone is stressed out. Everyone has way more on their plate than they think they can handle, and you're just trying to survive to make this idea into a project, into an actual company. And I think it's so easy to spend 200% of the energy on the task or the business at hand, and 0 to negative energy or time on the relationship. And I think that's my best piece of advice on this topic, is that you actually have to do work on that, calling out the elephants in the room, going to couples therapy, or whatever the tactics or mechanisms may be. But keeping that to be a principal part of how you start is an important part of how you can last. More questions. All right. Well, so actually, this one is really interesting, where it talks a bit about some of your inspirations. This question, you've obviously been inspired by your own family history, and you've been you've had obviously amazing access to talking to a lot of different people. Aside from your father and your family, who has been your greatest mentor, and what have you learned from them?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really, really fortunate to have several really important mentors in my life, and really people I found early on in my career around journalism, people who I'm still in touch with, who I still regularly talk to, people who encourage me. I think that finding mentor, I mean, for me, and I think for a lot of us, finding mentors it's hard work, and it requires work on your part. You can't just walk up to somebody and say, can you be my mentor? It's usually, it's usually more organic. You take an interest in somebody else's work, and you're interested in what they do, and you start to kind of ask them about what they do, and eventually you bring some of your work to them and ask for their feedback. And I was very fortunate to have that in my career. And in fact, one of my mentors lives here in Berkeley, and I see her pretty regularly. I've had mentors at different phases in my career who have been incredible. And now to this day, I still seek out mentors who have a lot more experience in business and in management. As I'm involved in 2 businesses that I founded, and I seek them out for guidance. One of them is a former head of NPR, Jarl Mohn, and it's just a terrific, brilliant guy who's just has an incredible career in media. And what I love about what I do, and is when I started out interviewing people, right? I've been in this business for 25 years. Right, in radio, now audio journalism, or audio storytelling, whatever you want to call it. And for the first sort of 5 to 10 years of my career, I was really okay as an interviewer. I was fine. I wasn't good. Then I got a little better, and then better and better. And it's like being a basketball player, standing at the free throw line. Like the first 10 years of your career, or when you start playing basketball, you're just going to miss a lot of those shots. And eventually you're going to make them, because you're really experienced being able to judge how far it is from that free throw line to the basket. And so now, 20,000 people later, I'm pretty good at what I do. But what I love about what I do, and I did it this morning, I'll do it tomorrow, and I'll do it later in the week, is I get better and better every time I interview somebody. I get better at it every time, and I feel it. I just interviewed Hamdi Olakaya of Chobani. We're not gonna put him on the show for another 3 months or so, because our process is long. But I could just feel in that interview this flow, that we were really digging into his life story in such a powerful way, because what I'm looking for from my guests, what I'm looking for them to do is not to burnish their reputations, or for me to elevate them and for people to think, oh my gosh, this person's amazing. I'm looking for them to be generous. I'm looking for them to come to that interview in a spirit of generosity, because our listeners depend on it. Our listeners are everybody from people like you to somebody who's got an Etsy store selling jewelry, or a Shopify store, or a brick and mortar, or people who don't run businesses but are working inside companies trying to think more creatively. And I need that person to come to that interview in a spirit of generosity, to share and open up and be vulnerable. And so to get to that place, I have to be really, really present in my job. I have to be a really active listener. And that is a skill I've developed over 25 years. It is not a superpower. I am not more talented or smarter or better than other people. I'm just really practiced at it. And I work really hard to get better at it. You know, when I'm sitting with you in an interview, or with Hamdi Ulukaya or Shanlin Mavzola, I am focused on you. It's like I have no social media, I have no distractions, my phone is not in the studio. It's just you and me and COVID in my head, in my ears, headphones, right? But just the two of us. And when you can experience that kind of conversation, by the way, very few of us get to do that. It's such a privilege, right? I think some of you might remember when you were young, you had a telephone in your house and there was a long cord and you could drag it to a closet and sit there and have a conversation in the dark. And we don't get to do that anymore because we communicate through texting and social media and it's quick. So I'm very privileged. I get to talk to people and have this active listening session, and I get better at it every time. And so that's, that to me is what I and that's a form of mentorship too. When I seek people out, I'm looking to extract their wisdom because it's going to make me better at what I do. That's the hope.
Well, I get a few more from the audience, and this one I really love. I think it's a super important question. I know you're working on it in some of the stories you're telling, which is, how can we continue to improve and accelerate the access to capital for people of color and for women?
Yeah, and I think that this has been every year. The numbers are moving ever so slightly. I think in the first year I was doing How I Built This was like 2% of venture money was going to women-founded businesses, and roughly that amount, and even less, was going to businesses founded by women of color, particularly. I think that what's been happening in the last year, and the jury's out. We will see if in fact all of the commitments from venture firms and from family offices and companies that have venture arms, if those commitments will indeed come to fruition. Mm-hmm. But there has been very overt commitments by the Goldman Sachses of the world and other large institutional investors to allocate a very significant portion of their money to women and founders of color. You're also seeing, I'm seeing sort of anecdotally I think a significant growth in the number of fund managers, both women and men of color, which is also something that has been sort of long overdue. One of the challenges I think has been that the way money has been allocated in general is that investors are looking to obviously mitigate risk. So they're looking for people who have a long track record of investing and can show the outcomes of that track record. Well, the reality is, if you don't have a track record, how are you going to start? How are you going to get the funding and the financing? And so I think what's happened over the last year and year and a half, from what I've seen anecdotally and even in conversations with investors, is that there has been, I think, a sea change in the approach to how you think about supporting and financing fund managers and founders. My hope is that is not just a blip, but that is actually the norm. This country is the most diverse, racially, ethnically, religiously, culturally. It's the most diverse human experiment in history, and that's a fact, right? And some of our greatest companies and ideas and businesses have been founded by immigrants, children of immigrants. And that will only continue, especially as our country becomes even more racially and ethnically diverse over the next 10 and 20 years.
So a question that was repeated actually on, I think I can count at least 3 of these note cards, is, who haven't you interviewed that is on the wait list, if you will, for
Yeah.
this audience and maybe the audience that's listening online? And who's just someone that you still want to talk to?
You know, the challenge is that I need you to come to the interview in a spirit of surrender. So we get 1,000 pitches a week.
Wow.
We do 45 Monday episodes and 45 shorter versions, How I Built This Lab. And every week we receive 1,000 pitches, which I'm just stunned. I mean, when I started this show 7 years ago as a side project,
Right.
was not never intended to become this kind of phenomenon. And obviously we're super honored by that, but it's a big responsibility because we have a big audience of 3.5 million people listening every week, and they expect us to meet a certain standard. Not just the audio fidelity, but the facts. You know, every episode of How I Built This is meticulously fact-checked. I do 7 to 10 hours of reading for every guest. It goes through multiple edits and fact checks. And then it gets an original score. The audio is mastered, so it sounds perfect to your ears. This is all we do. We only make audio shows. And so because we put so much care into it, we need guests who are also coming to the show in that spirit. So every guest that we invite onto the show, and we generally, we accept pitches, but we receive so many, and we spend so much of our time looking for great stories. I have a conversation with every guest before, and I say, look, here's what to expect. There's no rules. I'm going to ask you everything. It's very granular. We can't manufacture a conversation because our audience is going to, like, they're going to revolt. Like, they will not accept that. I have to be their avatar. And so, because sometimes we'll get pitches from publicists or companies. They'll say, well, you can't ask about this, and that. And my response to that is, I totally get it. You're doing your job to protect your client. Here's the thing. When your client is ready to talk openly and to surrender to the process and trust us, let me know, because we want to have that conversation. We want to have an honest, full 360-degree conversation. So that's the first thing, was we need the guest to be willing to do that. Now, there are some really interesting founders, and I'm not sure they're quite ready to do that yet. I mean, I'll give you an example of somebody I would love to interview. And I know I'm going to get potentially some weird sort of response to this. It's Kanye West, okay? Now, Kanye West would be a very challenging person to interview because is he going to come to the interview on a day where he's feeling self-reflective, or is he going to come to the interview on a day where he struggles, of course, but his story is quite remarkable. He's one of, I think, 8 black billionaires in the United States and has really built an incredible business around him, around who he is. The fact that he's widely considered to be the greatest, not just hip hop artist, but one of the greatest artists, like at Prince level, at Bob Dylan level in American history, is really significant. He's a very challenging person, very controversial. I think some of the things he's done have certainly challenged me as a listener to his music, but I think if we could have an open, honest conversation about his life that would be revealing and interesting to a general audience, even people his story, where he came from, how he became who he became, I think there would be a lot of value to that story. So, and there are other founders who I would say the same thing, that despite their challenging behavior sometimes, if they were willing to come on the show and talk about it in an open way, in a revealing way, then that's what I ask for. That's what I need.
My final question is a question that I know you've asked at least 500 times in your interviews, and it's, I think, apropos to maybe end it the way that you end a lot of your interviews, at least when the podcasts are aired, which is, how much of your success would you attribute to luck versus skill?
This is like the most controversial question I ask, because I did it at the beginning from episode 1 with Sarah Blakely, just as a kind of a throwaway thing, and then I kept doing it, and And every now and again, I get people who write in and say, I hate that question so much, and I hate you, and I want you to die. And I feel terrible. And I sometimes think, well, maybe I should stop asking it. And I did not ask it in 1 or 2 episodes. And then people wrote and said, why didn't you ask that question? I was waiting for it. So I'm kind of a prisoner of that question now. It's not designed to literally get the answer, and that's the answer to that question isn't what matters. Mm-hmm. The question is asked after a 3 to 4 hour conversation with somebody. Now, if you remember that Modern Love column in the New York Times where the writer talked about this questionnaire that can make you fall in love with somebody, do you remember that? Okay, and she did end up falling in love with the person she did it with. If I have a 3 to 4 hour interview with somebody, at the end of that conversation, it doesn't matter who it is, who it's with, we've developed a connection. Because I know so much about your life. And I have found out much more about your life in the course of the conversation. And you have too, because I've asked you questions that trigger memories from your life. So you've also now spent 4 hours reflecting on your life. When do we ever do that? We're not all Socrates. We don't reflect on our lives all the time. So there's something that happens. There's a connection, right? And I asked that question really as a vehicle or as a vehicle to allow the person to reflect on the last 4 hours. We've just talked now. Think about everything you've seen your own movie. We've been in the cockpit of your head. We've been in your consciousness, and we've driven through your life story. Like that show, that science show. When I was a kid, I can't remember the name. The Magic. School bus, like the Magic School Bus, okay? We've been on the Magic School Bus and you're through DoorDash, whatever your story is. Now, you've been there with me. It's pretty incredible, isn't it? Like you started out there and you're here. What do you think? How do you think that happened? And it's really just a chance for them to say, it is pretty crazy, and I worked really hard. Whatever they say, I worked really hard or I got lucky. In my case, I put a lot of stock in luck, and I'll tell you why. Because in August of 2000, I was a month before I was sent to Berlin to be the NPR correspondent in Eastern Europe, and I was terrified. I was not qualified. I was not ready for that. I was a total imposter. I was like, I fooled everybody. I pulled the wool over their eyes and convinced them that I could do this job. And I was terrified. I was really scared because I was like, what are they doing sending me there? I'm a child. August of 2000, I went to a barbecue in Washington, D.C. a month before I left. And I saw somebody there who I talked to. I mustered up the courage to talk to. And she's my wife today. Now, if I didn't go to that barbecue and she didn't go, I would never have met her. It was a month before I left to Europe for 7 years. We met there, and that was luck. Because without that person in my life, I wouldn't be doing what I do today. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be this person. I wouldn't have the confidence or the courage to do what I did. And so I've got to give a lot of credit to luck.
With that, let's celebrate Guy Raz.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, I think Guy's going to be here actually for some book signings, and so it's a great opportunity if you have yours or if you want to get a copy. I know we're going to be setting it all up in the lobby, and have a great night. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Fantastic.